Welcome to today's webinar, Making Your Mark, Converting Art, Jewelry, and Collectibles into Charitable Impact. My name is Colleen Boyle, and I'm the Managing Director and the Head of Business Development and Philanthropic Strategy for the Fine Art Group. The Fine Art Group is an independent global firm that specializes in valuation, advisory service, and lending capabilities for art, jewelry, and other valuable collectibles. And today we chose this topic because many of the collectors that we work with have varying motivations around collecting. Some are collecting for investment purposes, some have inherited collections, and others are driven by genuine passion and interest in a particular collecting category, whether it be art, jewelry, coins, cars, wine, watches, or other types of collectibles. However, not all collectors or their heirs understand the financial impact of a collection. In addition, they don't always recognize the importance of planning for their collections. Today, we have an esteemed panel of experts to discuss not only planning tips for collections, but also how to use collections towards charitable impact. I'd like to introduce Grace Yoon, who is the Head of Strategic Partnerships and Community Impact at Rockefeller Capital Management. As Head of Strategic Partners and Community Impact, Grace is responsible for deepening client relationships and elevating client engagement for the Rockefeller Global Family Office. In this role, Grace is focused on enhancing the overall client experience, including engagement with women and next generational family members, and advising families on financial education, lifestyle, and impact advisory solutions for clients. Grace is going to be our moderator today, and I'm going to turn the webinar over to Grace.
Thank you so much, Colleen. It is so exciting to be here. Hi, everyone. As Colleen mentioned, I'm Grace Yoon from Rockefeller Capital Management. As many of you may know, we are the legacy family office for the Rockefeller family, originally founded in 1882, and now advising over 7 generations of the Rockefeller family. And we have converted to a multifamily office, so we are working with many families across the board. Our mission is really to help empower our clients and their family members to live with purpose, to do the things that are most important to them. And that's alongside financial decisions, but also some of the non-financial aspects of their lives. I run our Rockefeller Lifestyle Advisory platform, and the Fine Art Group is one of our most cherished strategic partners because so many of our clients love art, love collecting art. And really, this discussion is so thrilling because we would love to talk today about how one can convert their art and collectibles into a family legacy and have philanthropic impact with that legacy. So it is my pleasure to introduce our speakers today. First, over to Lisi Madden here. Lisi is Head of Fiduciary Services at Rockefeller Capital Management. She's been at Rockefeller for over a decade and is a member of the firm's management committee. She's responsible for our 2 trust companies. She'll speak to them, our national charter as well as the Delaware entity. And prior to Rockefeller, Lisi was an attorney at Milbank for many years in trust and estates. The second speaker here will be Adrienne Hart. Adrienne is Head of Philanthropy at Rockefeller Capital Management. She joined Rockefeller a couple of years ago, and she's had many years as an attorney by background as well, counseling ultra-high net worth families and individuals on taxes, estates, business succession, as well as, of course, charitable and multi-generational wealth planning and administration. Finally, of course, Colleen Boyle is one of our speakers today. You all know Colleen. She's Head of Business Development and Philanthropic Strategy at the Fine Art Group. She, of course, brings over 20 years of experience in the art and financial world, and she's a pleasure to work with, of course, as a partner, valuing art and collectibles for international corporations, museums, and then, of course, private collectors across the globe. So with that, I'm going to actually just give a couple of housekeeping items here. We have 45 minutes of a moderated discussion. Please feel free to submit your questions because we will then take kind of Q&A and have some questions that I'll read through the chat that comes through towards the end of the last 15 minutes of the hour. So with that, I am so excited to begin. And the first question actually is going to go to you, Colleen. So, of course, collecting as it pertains to art, jewelry, and other collectibles has really been an incredible passion for so many of our clients. And we continue to see it be even more important over the last couple of years to our family office clients. So, maybe big picture, tell us a little bit about the different areas of collecting and why these passion assets are becoming so much more important to clients now in their overall wealth strategy.
Sure, Grace. So, clients are passionate about all different types of asset classes. So, whether it be art or watches or jewelry or wine or cars or antiquities. And part of the motivation is experiential. People enjoy going to art fairs and art shows. People enjoy learning more about artists and the motivation behind creating objects of art. Clients who are, car enthusiasts really enjoy driving their Porsches or Ferraris or other types of cars around the track and going to the concourses. Clients who are collecting wine, again, enjoy the experiential environment of going to wine tastings and trying to decide which Californian or which French wine to purchase. So there's a lot of experiences tied to these types of assets. And one thing we find is that these assets can be impulsive acquisitions, and there's not always a whole lot of due diligence that goes into acquiring these types of assets. So, as a result, these types of collections are often overlooked in the planning process. Most collectors are enjoying what they're collecting, they're living with their collections, and they just don't always understand the financial impact, nor are they always following trends. Many clients think that their collections are going to increase in value over time, and that's not always the case. And we're finding more and more frequently that collectors are not always having conversations with their families, with their advisors, or with their attorneys about really the disposition and the planning for these types of assets. I recently got a call from an attorney who has a client who's been a client for many, many, many years. This couple happens to be in their 80s. And in conversation, it just recently turned out that they had some artwork, and the attorney had no idea what they had. So he asked if I would go out and visit them, which I did. And it turned out they had a multi-million-dollar collection of artwork. They had period furniture. They had a significant coin collection, and this had never been discussed. They have three heirs. One of the heirs is the executor, and the heirs really did not have a lot of knowledge about these types of asset classes. And so we were able to do evaluation, help them to understand where the current market is for these objects, and really put together a divestiture plan because the heirs were not interested in being custodians of these objects. However, the clients love the objects and they're going to live with them for quite a long time. In fact, Grace, we find that if families don't discuss these types of assets and have a plan for the assets, there's a 70% failure rate in transferring assets across generations. And oftentimes, the breakdown in communication and education is really at the heart of these failed transitions, both loss of money and also impact to family relations, because families don't always understand value. And if one of the family members gets a really valuable asset and the other family member doesn't, that can cause some internal family strife. So it's real important to really understand what you have and to keep up with the trends and to talk to your advisors and to have a plan. But unfortunately, we see most of the time that's not the case.
So fascinating, Colleen, and so interesting. That 70% failure rate is somewhat alarming, but I think a lot of us who have seen situations like this come up quite a bit. And maybe I'll go over to Lisi on that point. So we see you've been working, of course, with the Rockefeller family for many years. Of course, the trust companies here at Rockefeller were set up to support the growing family over the couple generations here. So taking a step back, what are some of the basic estate planning considerations for people to really make sure that they're focused on when it comes to art and collectibles?
Well, thank you, Grace, and thank you, Colleen, and thank you, everyone listening, for joining us. And I'm so delighted to be talking to you, and also so honored to be part of such an amazing group of panelists. So welcome, everyone. And I will go very basic with that question, Grace, because first of all, nobody on the line now is going to be part of that 70%. Even though I can't see all your faces, I know that now. So thank you, Colleen, for making sure of that. But going to some of the core elements that are gonna, really drive your estate plan with these types of assets. Number one, the most basic is make sure that you maintain your items properly. You'd be surprised the damage that a piece of art in, positioned with sunlight, dust, it can all impact value at the end of the day. So just be very conscious and careful about how you maintain your assets. Another basic consideration, always make sure that you've got adequate insurance. And the reason I say that is because for insurance purposes, you're going to look at replacement value. Now, we're also going to talk about fair market value, which is a really important thing that we're going to be talking about in connection with your estate plan, but that's not what you're going to use for insurance purposes. And if you do, that's going to result in your pieces being wildly underinsured. So get the right insurance and keep reviewing those values on a regular basis. Now, Colleen touched on this too, and it is just critical. Think about your wishes as they relate to each particular item that you have. Who really wants this pocket watch? Who really wants this piece of modern art? And who's going to truly appreciate it? Who's going to be able to and want to care for it properly? And as Colleen mentioned too, have a think about what you want to do in the event that you give pieces that end up having different values to different people. Do you want some sort of equalization at the end of the day? Because that is important to you, and that's equalization clauses in documents is actually quite common. I see that a lot. And once you think about your wishes, communicate your wishes, you're storing and ensuring your stuff properly, talk through everything you have with your estate planning attorney. I can't emphasize this enough because she needs to know exactly what you have and exactly what its value is in order to advise you properly from an estate planning context. For example, if you end up having a collection that is very high in value, but not liquid, and you don't have a bunch of liquidity in your estate elsewhere, that may be a problem when it comes time to pay estate taxes, because unfortunately the IRS will not accept tax payments in kind. The other thing that your attorney might recommend based on what you have and its value is naming what's called an art executor. So if you've got some important art, and if in your will you name a regular executor who might not be a specialist in how to manage, market, value, and sell your art, you may think about having a special executor specifically appointed in order to manage those particular assets. And lastly, keep an inventory, keep details on each of the items that you have, and keep all the documentation that you have with respect to each such item. Documents that evidence title, provenance, values, authenticity, keep it all organize it all, and make sure it's readily available to your advisors.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Lisi. You bring up so many incredibly important points. And on the topic of valuation, and just going back to, again, Colleen, your 70% failure rate in terms of transitions with the art and collectibles within the family. It sounds like, of course, it's just important to take a very disciplined approach to the art and the collectibles as one would across other assets within one's wealth strategy. So Colleen, the question going back to you, as Lisi touched upon valuation and that being very important, tell us more about why it's very important and critical to understand the value of these assets and really what valuation means.
Yeah, sure, Grace. And Lacey brings up some really good points around the importance of inventory and also really the importance of understanding the value. That's really the foundation for being able to make decisions around planning and around succession planning and divestiture. I'm just going to share with you all a story that was recently in the news that equates to why it's important to understand value. So there was a couple who was in the process of downsizing, and they had like an estate sale to sell a lot of the contents of their property. One of the pieces that they owned that they had inherited and lived with for many, many years was this lovely 6-inch in diameter blue and white porcelain bowl. It sat in a curio cabinet. They enjoyed it, but really didn't know much about it. It had been passed down through one of the family members, and they sold it at their yard sale for $35. Somebody came along, purchased it for $35, took it to one of the international auction houses, and sold it for over $700,000. This is why it's very important to understand what you own and what the current market value is. Nobody wants to leave $700,000 or more money. That was just one piece on the table. So it's real important to understand value. As Lisi mentioned, there's predominantly two types of values that will come across. One is retail replacement value, which is the value that's used for insurance purposes if you are going to protect your objects. And if there is a loss, then how much would you be compensated for the loss of that object? That value is really determined by looking at the retail marketplace. If you had to go to a dealer, if you had to go to a retailer, how much would you pay to have that piece replaced? What Lisi was mentioning, though, from a planning perspective, we really look at what's called fair market value, and we look historically at what's been happening in the auction world. How much a piece has been selling for, and looking at historical data around a fair market value figure. Those two figures are quite different. And if anybody on today's webinar watches any of the shows on TV, whether it's Antique Roadshow or any of those other types of shows, pay attention next time to the type of value that's provided. They'll indicate the value's retail replacement, fair market. And it's important that you understand the difference. And it's also important, to Lisi's point, that you keep up with the value. If you purchased items in, say, between 2000 to 2006 in the Americana space, that was the height of the market. Your objects today may not be at that same value. That market has softened. So it's real important to not have a value at just one point in time, but to really understand the trends that are happening within the various asset classes.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Colleen. And as it pertains to planning for these beautiful objects, we talked about on our prep call here, of course, there's kind of those three options, right? Gifting, donating, and selling. And I'm going to turn over to you, Lisi. Can you give us a little bit more color around gifting or bequeathing these beautiful objects to individuals, and maybe some of the pros and cons of gifting during life versus at death?
I am so glad you asked that, Grace, because I've been waiting to get on to one of my favorite topics, which is transfer tax. It always excites me as a estate planning lawyer. I'll admit that. And
Love it.
your art and collectibles can absolutely be a part of any lifetime gifting plans that you have to family members and other individuals. Now, these lifetime transfers are subject to federal gift tax, but each individual has what's known as an annual exclusion from gift tax. This means that you each can give away each year up to a certain amount, transfer tax-free, to as many people as you'd like. And that amount for 2024 is $18,000. So I can give $18,000 to all my esteemed panelists this year without any transfer tax implications. I'm not going to because I can't. But in addition, each individual has what I'm going to call a unified exemption from gift and estate tax. And this can be used up during your life or at your death. And it is currently at an historic high, everybody, 13.61 million per person. And I'll also note that gifts that you may make could have state level gift tax consequences depending on where you live. So you decide to make these gifts. And by the way, that annual exclusion, that 18,000 I talked about, that doesn't eat in at all to your 13.61 million unified credit. They're totally separate. What are the pros, you asked, Grace, of making gifts during your life versus waiting until you die? Well, one of the pros is that all of that post-gift appreciation, because you were advised by Colleen and found a spectacular piece and it is just shooting up in value. You gift it, and afterwards, all that appreciation is out of your estate for transfer tax purposes and passes transfer tax free. You can also, by making the gift now, lock in that historically high unified exemption amount that I talked about, which, by the way, this is a very exciting time in transfer tax world. It's scheduled to sunset after 2025 and reduced by about half unless the laws are changed before the end of 2025. So what are some of the cons? Well, the person you gift to takes what's known as a carryover basis. You might have heard this term thrown around. It basically just means that the person you gift to takes your basis in the piece, which sometimes can be really low and could result in significant capital gains when the donee goes later to sell that piece. You also give up your own use and enjoyment, potentially, but not always. And then there's also the risk that the asset decreases in value, and then you've, quote, wasted your exemption and made your estate planning lawyer mad. Now, gifts at death. Okay, so you don't want to gift your art and your collectibles during life. That's fine. It's their fair market value are going to be included in your estate at your death for estate tax purposes. And again, each person has that historically high $13.61 million unified credit that's going to be applied against the value of your gross estate. But if the value of what you own at death exceeds that exemption level that you have left at that time, there could be estate tax due. And by the way, depending on the state you live in, there could be state estate tax due as well. But the pros of waiting until you die is that the donee may receive what's called a step up in cost basis to fair market value as of the date of death. So they're not going to take your basis, your stinky old tiny basis. They're going to be able to take a basis equal to what that piece is valued at your date of death. So this could save the donee beneficiary a lot of capital gains tax when she goes to sell it. And you also get to enjoy the piece during your life. The potential downsides, you lose the benefit of that post-gift appreciation that we talked about. You also risk not locking in that historically high unified exemption amount that we spoke about. And it also may impact the liquidity of your estate at the end of the day. So you have to be very careful to make sure that you don't keep art and collectibles that may become problematic from a liquidity perspective when you die.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Lacey. So again, going back to planning for these beautiful objects that we've collected, either first, of course, being able to gift what Lacey just mentioned, donate, which is what I'm going to kind of ask Adrian here to talk about, and later Colleen will talk about selling. But Adrian, Colleen mentioned this whole dynamic we're seeing a lot more, which is families passing on to their heirs these incredible collections, but the heirs or the next gens are kind of looking at these objects and they're like, wait, I don't have the space for them. I have no idea what to do with them. And there's just a lot of stuff here. Sometimes it resonates with that individual or those individuals, and sometimes it doesn't. So what are you kind of seeing in this kind of dynamic, and what are some of the charitable giving options, quite honestly, for these passion assets?
Sure. So similar to giving to individuals, you can give to charity at death or during life. At death, contributing a collection or an object to charity is going to reduce the value of your estate through the estate tax charitable deduction. Another benefit to doing this is maybe there's a desire to make charitable gifts at death, but also liquidity concerns for non-charitable beneficiaries. Using these passion assets to fund the charitable commitment frees up liquidity for the non-charitable beneficiaries of the estate. On the other hand, giving during life is becoming a more popular approach to philanthropy. It provides the donor with the ability to actively participate in and to see the impact their giving has on the organizations and the causes that are important to them. So when you're using passion assets for lifetime charitable giving, that's going to come with a few more nuances in terms of the tax implications than at death. When you are giving this type of asset, your gift is either going to be deemed to be for a related use or a non-related use to the recipient charity. A related use is a use that is related to the recipient charity's exempt purpose. An example of this would be donating a classic car to a car museum for display. A non-related use is a use that is not related to the recipient charity's exempt purpose. An example of this would be donating a classic car to a library, which doesn't have a reason to display it. Or even going back to the first example, donating a classic car to a car museum, but that museum doesn't intend to display it and instead wants to sell it to generate cash flow. This would be a non-related use, even though the object could be used towards the exempt purpose. It's not being used for that purpose, and so that's deemed non-related. Whether the gift is for related or non-related use matters for tax purposes. These options will have different tax implications and different outcomes depending on the donor's basis and the object or the collection being contributed and what type of vehicle the donor intends to use for the contribution, if any. So back to the car example, if the contribution is to a public charity for related use, the museum intends to display the car as part of its collection. The donor receives an income tax deduction for the contribution calculated on the fair market value of the car. But if the museum does not intend to use the car, it's for non-related use, the donor is limited to a deduction calculated on the lesser of fair market value or basis. And while it may not seem so beneficial to the donor to take a deduction calculated on basis if that basis is really low, it's important to keep in mind that by contributing the object to charity, the donor is passing all the embedded gain out of his or her estate, off the balance sheet, into the charity. And then when the charity goes to sell it, the charity, depending on its status, is going to pay little to no tax on that gain. For individuals, where if the donor was going to sell the asset, the donor is subject to tax on that gain. Collectibles are taxed at a minimum rate of 28% and may also be subject to the 3.8% Medicare surtax as well. So if there's a large embedded gain in the object, while the donor may be limited to calculating their income tax deduction on basis, they're benefiting from not recognizing any of that gain and avoiding the 28 or 31.8% tax on that gain. So in the examples I've given so far, I've talked about contributions to public charities. Donors can also make contributions to other types of charities like private foundations or donor advised funds. Using a private foundation, depending on the type of foundation, the donor may still need to go through the related versus non-related use analysis and the AGI limitations for how much can be deducted may be lower. For a donor advised fund is treated as a public charity. So there's never going to be a related use for a donor advised fund just because of the way they operate. So the deduction will be limited to the lesser of fair market value or basis, but that's not to say this strategy can't be the best option for a donor. Donor advised funds are great tools. They allow donors to contribute cash and other assets generate an upfront income tax deduction, shift gain off the balance sheet, and then the donor can use the assets in the DAF to give to various public charities over time. DAF providers have become much more comfortable in recent years accepting these types of contributions, and then working with, for example, the Fine Art Group to monetize these assets within the donor advised fund account, creating liquidity to be used to distribute to various charities. There's also, a lot of attention lately, I think, around charitable LLCs. And I think there's a pitfall here in thinking that the contribution to a charitable LLC will be eligible for an income tax deduction. Charitable LLCs are not actually charitable vehicles. They do not receive tax exempt status from the IRS. Contributions to these entities have no immediate tax implications. Rather, when the assets that are contributed are ultimately passed out to charities, that's when the donor can receive an income tax deduction with that type of vehicle.
Fascinating. So it's such a fascinating topic, and we're seeing a lot of clients now realizing that this is an option, especially some of these next gen clients who, again, inherit kind of these collections, don't know what to do with them. So actually having this as an option to donate these passion assets to a nonprofit is super fascinating. But Colleen, maybe rounding out those three options of gifting, donating, and selling being, of course, something that a lot of folks do, but then also these nonprofits can be doing as well if they are given these assets. Tell us kind of what are the key considerations regarding kind of selling these types of assets?
Sure, Grace. So, while we see clients somewhat buy impulsively on the acquisition side, and we always recommend to have a well thought through strategy on acquisition, we recommend the same on the sell side because there are a lot of factors to consider when you're selling your valuable passion assets. And we always keep in mind, and it's something to be aware of, there is a lot of emotion tied to these assets. They're experiential. There's stories related to these assets. So a couple of factors to consider. Should the items be sold privately or should they be sold via a public auction? If they're going to be sold via public auction, which auction house? Which geographic venue? Should the collection sell in New York or London or Geneva or Hong Kong? Or maybe the item, especially if it's jewelry, should travel to all those venues before reaching its destination for sale. Should it be in a specialty sale? Should it be in a single owner sale? Have the fees been negotiated? There are fees to sell and they are negotiable. What's the marketing strategy? What type of year is the sale taking place? And will that make a difference on the results? Are the estimates accurate? Are they too high? We always recommend conservative estimates to entice bidding. You just need two people to drive up the value of an object. So there are a lot of different factors to consider when thinking about selling either one object or an entire collection of objects. But the one trend I wanted to mention on today's webinar is the rise of the single owner sale. We are seeing more and more collectors really wanting to strategize around a single owner sale if in fact their collection warrants that. And that ties into what Adrienne mentioned related to philanthropy. So I'm going to share two stories. Sometimes plans are set, but then they might be altered due to a life-changing situation. And this was the case with this one family that we had the opportunity to work with. The matriarch and patriarch were avid art collectors, but they also had a very significant collection of Tiffany lamps. The matriarch had fallen ill very unexpectedly and very rapidly. And the family was trying to figure out what to do with some of these assets. There were two heirs. They were grown with households full of objects. They took a few pieces, but they were not interested in being custodians of either collection. And what we decided to do is we came together and really talked through what did the family want to do and how could they create a legacy to honor the matriarch. And what we all came up with was a single owner sale for the artwork, with the proceeds going to the matriarch's alma mater as a scholarship fund. And then the Tiffany lamps got placed in a very specialized Tiffany sale. Still, those proceeds going to that scholarship fund. So it was a way for the family to use these assets that both the patriarch and matriarch were very passionate about, had spent a lifetime collecting, enjoyed the experience, and now they were able to create a legacy to honor their mother. We had a similar situation with another family. In this case, it was the patriarch that was the collector, and he was an avid book collector. In fact, during his lifetime, he had acquired over 1,500 books in modern literature. And when he passed, his surviving spouse and his two heirs did not share that passion. And again, they were trying to figure out a solution for this collection. And we took a similar approach. The family was very, very philanthropic. They had specific charities that they wanted to support. So we were able to structure a single owner sale at a highly specialized book auction. And there was a lovely write up in a catalog about the patriarch, him as a collector, as well as a philanthropist, as well as a listing of the books that the family got to keep. And all the proceeds actually were transferred into the family's multi-generational donor advised fund. And then those proceeds could be allocated out to the various charities that the family wanted to continue to support in honor of the patriarch. So we're seeing a lot more conversation and real creative ways to utilize these assets from a selling perspective to support charitable impact.
Wow, those are such incredible stories, Colleen, and so incredible for us listening here and thinking through these type of strategies. Going back to Lisi, I think one of the questions that we talked about earlier was, of course, gifting outright to an individual. There are also other entities, that we can consider. So just wanted to kind of take a step back again as you think about, ownership outright to an individual versus some of the entities.
No, absolutely. And geez, Colleen, listening to that, just you made the argument for the art executor better than I could have at all. I mean, there's so many considerations and so much complexity in this world that you almost need a professional. But anyway, as I mean, to Grace's great question, as I'm sure you've heard before, outright ownership has obvious and clear benefits, of course, but it has some pretty significant drawbacks, which include the assets being subject to the owner's creditors, the owner being responsible, him or herself, for caring for and maintaining the asset, which sometimes, as we've talked about before, you just don't have. So a trust structure is one alternative to outright ownership that is considered a great deal in our world. The idea here is that you'd set up a trust either during your life or to be created at death, and that trust could own the assets for the benefit of any one or more named beneficiaries. What does this do for you here? Well, you've got then beneficiaries who can use and enjoy the piece without subjecting these assets to potential claims of creditors. If you set up the trust during your life, you could also potentially arrange to lease back any of the pieces that are owned by the trust for fair market rent, of course, paid by you to the trust. But this would be a way to allow you to continue to enjoy them during your life. We've also seen this type of structure as quite useful in a blended family situation. For example, if you wanted to provide, say, that a second spouse who survives you has the benefit of certain artwork, but then you want to ensure that that artwork is left to, say, children of yours from a first marriage upon the death of that second spouse. That's just one example. Another final consideration with the trust structure that I wanted to point out is just, as Colleen highlighted so beautifully, you got to make sure you have a trustee who's capable of managing the collection properly. And that job is can be a big job that requires some real expertise. Not only making sure that the art's preserved properly, but also keeping up with those detailed inventories we discussed, making sure the insurance is adequate, and if it's sold, negotiating all those contracts with the auction houses, figuring out whether you do a private sale or go with one auction house versus the other, and how do you negotiate, what's the extent of your ability to negotiate, etc. And so I will take this opportunity as a shameless plug for the Rockefeller Trust Companies, if I may, because we are professional trustees that do have experience managing these kinds of assets and trust. The other thing you consider too, another entity that we see a lot in lieu of outright ownership is a family LLC or LP. It's just another way to provide for some centralized management of a collection, as your named manager or general partner would be the one responsible for the day-to-day management, storage, insurance, etc. And a lease back from the entity is also a possibility here. And that if you create one of these entities during your life and transfer your collection into it in exchange for an interest in the entity, you can then, if you'd like, gift interest in that entity, maybe even on a yearly basis, using that fancy $18,000 per donee annual exclusion that you now know about so well. And that means that you can give away pieces of the entity, and then your collection, though, stays intact as it continues to be owned by one entity, this family entity that's managed by somebody who knows how to handle it.
Thank you so much, Lisi. So fascinating. And maybe Adrian, building upon what you kind of were talking about earlier, clients contributing collections to a foundation or a donor advised fund, and also kind of building on some of the examples Colleen was giving previously in terms of, maybe what trends are you seeing in that area in terms of, again, contributing collections to a foundation or a donor advised fund, and what would be the pros and cons? You started explaining some of that to us, but just wanted to kind of double click on that.
Sure. Yeah. So we have some clients who have used the private foundation structure to operate museums to display their collections. That would be a related use contribution, like I talked about before, if it's a private operating foundation. And that is a really cool strategy. I can't say that it's a very common strategy. Typically, we see our donors, our clients, either seeking out institutions to partner with. And when a donor is doing that, it's really important to talk to the institution first, make sure they're willing and able to accept the collection or the object, and make sure there's a clear understanding of how the object's going to be used. And when donors aren't going that route, a lot of times they're going to use a donor advised fund for the contribution. Whether they sell it first and contribute the cash whether they sell the asset first and contribute the cash to the donor advised fund, or contribute the object directly to the donor advised fund and then have the DAF liquidate it and liquidate it post contribution. That decision really depends on an analysis of the tax implications, minimizing capital gains or maximizing the charitable deduction, which has the best outcome for the donor. But those are typically the strategies that we see.
Awesome. And just in terms of taking a time check here, we're 45 minutes in. So please, if anyone has questions, feel free to message them into the chat box here on the Zoom webinar. So while we're kind of getting some questions that way, wanted to ask you, Colleen, something that we've been talking about are kind of these next gens and these heirs and inheritors here. Around passion assets. What are some of the trends you're seeing specifically around next gens and passion assets here? Would love to kind of get your thoughts on that.
Sure, Grace. So, I mean, we're seeing what everybody's mentioned today on the webinar. Next gen may be interested in a few objects, but usually not interested in being the custodians of an entire collection that the matriarch or patriarch may have acquired. And also, if the next gen is the executor, it can be a real burden, as Lizzie mentioned, if in fact they're not educated about the collection, if they're not aware of value, if they're not sure really what to do with the collection. So we're seeing more and more families really trying to have proactive conversations to figure out who's interested, who has the means of taking care of any part of the collection because it is costly. And if there isn't interest, what are the other alternative solutions? And we're seeing more and more conversations around this idea of creating legacy, whether it's through what Adrian mentioned, possibly through a foundation or through a monetization strategy, with a single owner sale or part of a specialty sale, with proceeds really being allocated to really charities of choice or passion investments. There's so many concerns in today's world that Next Gen is concerned about and they'd like to support. And if the family has a coin collection that nobody's interested in and Next Gen wants to support the environment, they could do that via the coin collection and being strategic around which vehicle to utilize to help support their philanthropic impact. So those are the types of trends we're seeing is really not always interested in being custodians of the assets, but really interested in either creating legacy or additionally wanting to have philanthropic impact using these types of assets as a means to do so.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Colleen. And I think this first question is actually maybe a follow-up to that, but it's really for any of you to chime in here. The question is, how does one, I think it's kind of maybe coming from a next gen, how does one begin this conversation with the patriarch, matriarch on succession planning for art and collectibles, especially when they are such emotional objects? I don't know if anyone wants to start that.
I can start that. I think part of it really depends on the family dynamic. Okay, so if you have a family that's very amicable, the conversation tends to be more organic and very proactive. It becomes more challenging when it's possibly a blended family, or maybe the heirs don't necessarily get along, and there could be a challenged family dynamic. That does make the conversations more difficult. I think the one thing, though, is it is important going back to what we talked about earlier in the presentation is really just understanding value to start. And the matriarch and patriarch can actually initiate that process. And that might help too to better understand, you know, what the next steps would be. Oftentimes, a lot of people think that their collections are worth more than they actually are. And we're finding that there's specific markets that have really softened. And there might be an opportunity to talk more thoroughly about the softening aspects of the market versus those portions of the market that have appreciated. And sometimes too, if all of a sudden family members realize, oh, wait, that's not worth as much as I thought it was worth, again, it could also transition the conversation. But like you say, and Adrian, I don't know if you have any other additional comments to add, but I do think a lot of it depends on the family dynamic. But just having an organic conversation and understanding the value is always a good way to start.
I completely agree with that, Colleen. And look, estate planning conversations are never easy conversations to broach. They really aren't. But one option that sometimes yields some good results is just keeping the conversation to start with quite general on general estate planning. Making sure that everybody understands where stuff is and what everybody's responsibility is if something were to happen, and who they should go to. And also don't hesitate to lean on your advisors as well. This is what we do every day. So we can help with those. We can try to help with those conversations too.
Yeah, and I think, bringing philanthropy into the conversation, a shameless plug for the topic, is a really unifying aspect to the conversation and can really help to move the ball forward.
All really great points. And this is kind of a dynamic we see a lot every day here at Rockefeller Capital Management. So it's great to hear all of your views. The next question here is actually around financial advisors. Actually, how can financial advisors or any of the advisors here around these families, it says, can see art as an asset within a portfolio? So I guess the question's really maybe coming from a financial advisor. How can they start this conversation with a family client? So maybe I'll ask Colleen if you want to start
Yeah,
with
I
that
can
one.
start. I can start that too. So, part of it is observation. So again, being a little bit more organic. So if somebody walks in with a luxury watch on their wrist or maybe a very expensive handbag, you can always start, around that type of conversation. But really, the easiest way to start is around insurance. You can always ask if an individual has any type of objects scheduled on their insurance policy or even asked to review it. That will actually give you an indication of some of the items that they might already have scheduled from the standpoint of risk protection and will possibly open up the door for a deeper, further conversation. But again, keep in mind, to Adrienne and Lisa's point earlier, it really takes a team, and we're all here to assist. We talk to clients day in and day out about what they own. We know exactly what to ask and how to ask it as part of the discovery process. So it's something that you don't need to go at it alone through this process. And it actually is more beneficial to the client if you do bring in a team of professionals who can help you with these types of conversations with your clients.
Cool. Yeah, and Lisa or Adrienne, I don't know if you guys want to jump in.
Well, that was pure poetry. I don't think I have anything to add. Colleen,
Great. So the next question I'm seeing here is actually around NFTs and digital assets. So,
Gosh.
and I think so. I'm pretty sure, Colleen, you're going to be the one to first address
Yeah.
this. So just thoughts on valuations around NFTs and digital assets, and then considerations around gifting, donating, or selling. So we will be bringing in Lisa and Adrienne at some point on this question too.
Yeah. So, a year and a half ago, everybody was talking about NFTs. Like that was the hot topic. Today, we're rarely talking about NFTs just because the market has completely changed. So the challenge with an NFT and it's really just about the data. Most NFTs are really just held for about 45 days. That's the standard. And the average value of an NFT average is about $2,500. So the question is, it's really transacted very differently. What I would recommend, though, to follow is to follow just the potential tax law changes. And Lisa might have some more information about this on whether the NFTs are going to be considered as a collectible or as a security. And that will definitely make a difference from the standpoint of a tax implication. And that would be the trend definitely, to follow. But from the standpoint of valuing the NFT, a lot of it's just going to depend on what the individual owns and what the cost basis is. It may not have changed or it may have gone down.
Anyone else want to add to that?
well, I would also say, again, this is key data for your estate planning attorney because digital assets generally are going to be important provisions. Provisions around digital assets generally too are going to be important provisions to have in your testamentary documents as well. So storing the information, accessing the information. So for sure, this needs to be on your inventory and a consideration when you talk to your estate planning lawyer if this is in your inventory.
And I'll just add on the philanthropy side of things, given what Colleen just said about the quick turnaround time for the transactions around this type of asset. I haven't, as of yet, typically seen these used to fund clients' charitable.
Awesome. I know we've got a couple minutes left here, but there's one more question. Actually, maybe Lisi, for you. You talked about the tax laws changing or potentially changing in 2026. Can you expand upon that?
Oh, gladly. Yes. I don't know what's going to happen, but I do know if nothing happens, your unified exemption, which is now at a historic high of $13.61 million per person. And again, that's your total, the total amount that you can pass either by gift, or at death, or a combo. So you can use 10 million of that exemption now, and then if you die this year, you'll have the balance remaining to be applied against the value of your estate. The law that currently puts this in place is scheduled to sunset at the end of 2025. And so the old law will then come back into effect. And that, under that old law, your exemption is going to be $5 million indexed for inflation for us from 2010. So it's going to be somewhere around the 6 million something mark. So it's going to go back down significantly unless there's action taken to change that law before 2025. So the main message around that is, if you want to and can comfortably give during your life, you should do that sooner rather than later, and think about doing it sooner rather than later because of this potential cut in the exemption rate. Now, that said, you don't want to gift more than you're comfortable with. So again, you can't let the tax tail wag the dog here. You have to maintain in your own name and under your own auspices enough where you feel comfortable that you can, continue your lifestyle during your life. But to the extent that you do feel comfortable, making gifts, it's better to do it sooner rather than later.
Awesome. We've got 1 minute here left. And so I figured I will just ask each of you to provide final thoughts here. So maybe I'll do it in the order of Adrienne, Lisi, and then Colleen. So over to you, Adrienne.
Sure. So I think the final thought I would add is that it's just so important for a donor to take the time to think through and to consult their advisors to come up with a thoughtful strategy around contributions like this. Before executing on a contribution of passion assets or any charitable contribution, really, donors should give thought to the ultimate charitable outcome that they're hoping for. What do they want to achieve? What's the timeline for that? And what's the level of involvement that they're hoping to have? This, in my opinion, is so much more important than the tax implications of a transaction. A tax benefit is lovely, but at the end of the day, the donor really needs to have the right strategy and entity in place to further their philanthropic goals for the years to come.
Awesome, Adrienne. Lisi, final thoughts.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you, Grace. And we've thrown a lot at you. And so I just want to say, keep in mind that, planning for your loved ones with your loved things is something that will evolve and change through your lifetime. It's going to change, and it's going to need to be revisited at a number of junctures during your life, including when there are changes to your family structure, grandkids arrive, when there are changes to the tax laws, and when there are changes to your assets, the amount of them and their composition. So it's not a set it and forget it kind of thing. And it's definitely something that's going to evolve and be part of discussions during your life.
Awesome. And Colleen, it has been such a thrill and pleasure to co-host this incredible webinar with you. So thank you. Final words, Colleen, from you.
Sure, Grace. And thanks to all the panelists as well. It's been a really, really fabulous conversation. So 2 things. It's never too early to have a conversation. So having conversations about what you own and who may be interested or what the plan might be, it's never too early to have that conversation. And to Lisi's point, and the plan might change, and that's okay. but at least having the conversation and starting an initial plan. And then secondly, you don't have to go at it alone. It really is helpful to have a team of professionals to be available to support you, to answer questions, to give you guidance and direction. And I think I speak on behalf of the entire panel. We are all here to really assist and help and to answer any type of question.
Awesome. Colleen, Lisi, Adrian, thank you all so much. You're incredible panelists here today. And
Grace,
thank
you were
all.
moderator extraordinaire. Thank you.
Well, and thank you. And thank you everyone for listening on today's webinar and for all these incredible questions. It's such a thrill to talk about this important topic with you. And as Colleen mentioned, we are all here to help. We can, take questions at Rockefeller Lifestyle at Rockefeller.com. Love the fact that we've had this conversation with you all. And Colleen, thank you so much. The Fine Art Group